So this project has got 2 borders, and I have cut these out already. Our first border out of the black fabric is cut at 1.5 inches, and our second border is cut at 3 inches. And of course, these are cut the width of the fabric. And so on the second border, I have already pieced our strips together, and I do a nice wide 1/4-inch seam allowance on that, cutting off of those selvages before we start to sew. Okay, when we're going to add a border to a quilt, we want to do a couple of things first of all. This is the side of our table runner. I've got a cutting mat here that has a ruler on it. So I'm going to measure the side of our table runner, and mine is measuring at 14.5 inches. So when you add the border to the quilt, we are going to, let's cut that selvage off this border, and I'm going to measure 14.5 inches of border, and I'm going to pin it. I don't want to cut it off at that. I don't want to cut off the border at 14.5 inches, but if you pin it, then there's just that's going to really help you make sure that your quilt is nice and square and flat. One thing that's really easy to do, especially when we are doing wider borders, is to kind of stretch that fabric as we're adding the border to the quilt. So it's really easy to add extra inches of border onto our quilt. So you always want to measure the side that you are sewing that border to, and then measure that length of border and then pin that to your quilt. So let's bring this over to the sewing machine and start to sew. I'm going to put one more pin in here for good measure. Actually, when we start, see, I'm just going to go just not even 1/4 of an inch past the edge of my quilt. So now I'm going to adjust this down here. That way, I'm not going to short myself on the fabric at the top of the border. And that'll make sense when we start to trim that off. So this is just like our other piecing. When we start to piece, I'm going to just start out a little bit slow, do a little back stitch, take that pin out. And again, as we sew this border on the edge of the quilt, you just want to keep those raw edges matched, and then also just be aware of what direction that seam allowance is supposed to be facing underneath. I guess technically you could sew it with the border on the front of the quilt, but sewing it from the back side so you could see those seam allowances, but I think I just like to see that border fabric on the top. So we're going to come all the way down here to the end and just sew off and cut that. Now, after we get the border sewn on the one side, you're going to bring in the iron. I like to just do a little set with that iron to set that seam, and then we're just going to push that border out. So the seam allowance is actually going to be going towards the border. That's going to give it a lot less bulk inside the quilt, giving that some steam. So after that, let's move all our borders over to this side. Okay, so after we've sewn this border on the edge of the quilt, this is where we started. And remember I said, let's start just a little bit over the edge. So after we've sewn that first border on, I like to line a ruler up. I do like to see a line of the ruler on the edge of the border and the edge of the quilt. That lets me know that this is a nice right angle. And then I'm just going to trim off that excess. And let's bring it over to the other side. And let's line this up on the edge of the quilt. See, we're going to line that edge of the border along that line of the ruler, and then this side of the ruler along the edge of the quilt. What we really want to achieve when we are adding borders and a binding to a quilt is a really nice 90-degree angle corner. We want a really nice corner, and this is going to help us get that. Okay, so now this is one strip of fabric. This is not long enough to do this whole second border. So I'm going to save this piece for our other short end and just grab another strip, because on this project, this is going to be long enough for our other side. So we can measure this to see how long it is, and then we'll add this border. What I'm going to do to make that a little bit easier is fold that in half. And then this is going to be 18 and 18 is, what's 18 and 18? 36, 37, 38. So this is 38 inches. Hope I added that right. And so let's cut the selvage off of this one. And we're going to go 18 plus 18 plus our 2 inches, and I'm going to put a pin in that. Sometimes this seems just a little bit tedious, but I think you'll be so much happier with the end result. Now again, I'm going to go just like 1/8 of an inch past that border with this second border. That's going to help me get a really nice square corner. We're going to pin that here. Let's put a pin down here. This is where we measured. We're going to put this pin down here. Kind of see how nicely that fits. We get a little bit, there we go. And then we're going to put a pin in the middle. Now sometimes as you're sewing the border on, you'll just need to do a little bit of adjusting, and that's okay. Like for instance, we might need just the extra little 1/4 of an inch of border, and I think that's pretty typical in a quilt if you have to do a little bit of adjusting. But if you find that this border is a lot longer than it should be, then you want to go back and double check your pressing. So here we go down this second side. Let's make sure that seam allowance is going the right way. See how nice and flat that is all the way up to that pin. And we're going to continue to go around the whole quilt just like this with our first border. Okay, now this second border is on, and we're going to bring the iron over, set that seam, and then just push that border out. I like to kind of get the tip of the iron in there, give that a little bit of steam. Doesn't that look nice? Sometimes these borders are called framing borders because that's exactly what it's doing. It's just really framing our quilt. I think the black was a really nice choice for this. All right. All right, so now here is our extra. Let's grab our ruler. Line the top of that border along the top edge of that border. There's the side of our quilt. Trim that off. And now we're ready to go on the next side. So I'm going to get that other short piece. This was the piece that we used on that first side. This is definitely long enough. Now the side of our quilt is a little bit longer. Remember that first side was 14.5 inches? Well, now we've actually sewn a border on that. So our measurement for this one is going to be almost 16 inches. So I'm going to go a little bit past that, come down here to the 16-inch mark, and let's put in a pin. I was having so much fun saying we're not using pins, but I think you'll be glad that you're using a few to sew your border on. We'll put one just at the beginning and the end. There we go. So again, we're going to start out slow. Do a little back stitch at the beginning. Some people like to, well, I don't know if anybody likes to sew over pins. I just think it's a good general rule of thumb to take the pins out. Seems like it never fails. When I think I can sew over a pin, that's the one time my needle comes down right on top of that pin, and I've broken my sewing machine needle. So it's just a good rule of thumb to take that needle out. Okay, all the way down there to the end. All right, so now set this seam. Now on some quilt projects, you will sew the border on maybe the two sides and, the two sides and then the top and bottom. But especially because this is just a solid black, notice I have kind of sewn all the way around the quilt with that border. And it's a really nice look, and it actually uses a little bit less fabric than sewing it on the other way. So that's sewn on. Last cut here. And edge of the quilt, top of the border, trim that off. So now I'm going to get another one of the long strips. Now this one is going to be even longer because it's got borders on both sides, right? So let's bring this here and start at this end. See if I can do math. What did we decide? 18 and 18 is 36 plus 37, 38 and a half, so 39 inches. So let's measure 39 inches. Let's cut that selvage off first. You know, that selvage is just a much more tight weave of fabric, so it's always a good idea to just take that off. So 18 plus 18, 36, 37, 38, 39. And let's put our pin at our 39-inch mark. Put this right sides together, which is pretty great with a woven solid because both sides are right sides. Okay, we're going to go a little bit past this border here. Put in a pin, and let's bring it down and put our pin in down here at our 39 inches. One in the middle for good measure. And we are ready to go. Last one. Okay, starting out slow, back stitch. Let's get that pin out of there. Now this one is kind of fun because all the seam allowances are pointing towards me. So I love sewing this side. It just goes much faster. I don't need to double check. So you feel like you can zip right along on this part. All right, let's take that out. And off we go. Matching up these raw edges. Now this is a great holiday project. And the great thing about holiday projects is the holiday comes back every single year. And so there is not a bad time to work on a holiday project. But this would be a great pattern for any fabric. Really pretty to do with leftover fabric from other projects. Okay, so we're gonna set this seam one last time. Start on this end. So see, that's what happens. You start adding these borders and your project starts getting a little bigger. So let's set this seam. That ruler. Now we're gonna push that border away. One thing you do want to avoid is you don't want to have a little fold in your fabric right here. That's another reason why I really kind of like pushing that nose of the iron. Slide that down. Push that nose of the iron into this. Give it a little zap of steam. Pretty, pretty. Okay, so now our border is all sewn on, but we need to clean up these last little tails on this last border strip that we sewed down. Oop. All right, edge of the ruler along the top. This one is along the side. Trim that off. This other side, just have a little one. Guess I'm doing this one upside down. That's okay. So edge of the ruler along the top. This side of the ruler is along the edge of the quilt. Now this, see how this looks just a little bit, it looks off? And that's basically because we're working with fabric. So what I do in that case is I just say, okay, you need to be out this way a little bit. That's just gonna really kind of straighten that out. And that's, we're not actually stretching the fabric. We're just kind of telling these seams, hey, you needed to be over here. And so that just kind of helps straighten that up. Because it's not going to be your piecing, it's just going to be in that pressing. So we're going to trim that off. And our first border is all complete. So now you are going to sew the second border on exactly the same way that you did the first border. And now I want to show you a little twist on this project.